Well, thanks for joining me today, Lisa. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a little bit. Is have one of our chefs on our podcast, and as we were talking about well, I feel like ever since I talked to you about doing an episode, is yeah, and like you just mentioned, we could probably spend hours talking about all this stuff. So I hope to have you for more than just this one episode. But today we're talking specifically about a thing that I think is very valuable for a lot of people that are a lot of the clients that we work with, is how to be a more efficient cook in the kitchen, or maybe even not in the kitchen. Who knows? Just a more efficient cook in general. So happy to have you here with me.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, how to be a more efficient cook? What I feel like this is an obvious thing. A lot of people are probably like, "Oh, how do I, spend less time in the kitchen? How do I, work faster? Yada yada yada." But from your perspective, what made this be the first one that you wanted to talk about?
Well, it's just something I can speak to from my own experiences because I have, been in the kitchen in various capacities over many years. And these are things that I've just learned as I've gone on. So I didn't do all of the things I'm going to be talking about today. I haven't always done myself, but I've learned to hone my process. And I've noticed that I've really enjoyed my time in the kitchen more ever since I've implemented a lot of these things. And it's just become a better experience overall to be in the kitchen. So I want to share those things with everybody else.
Share the love. I love it.
Yeah.
It's surprising, even some of the tips as I was looking through some of the material for today. I'm like, oh yeah, this is all really like, it's not super complex. Some of it may arguably be depending on the person, but I mean, anytime that I can, or we can, you can, whoever we are talking to or working with, make working in the kitchen a more enjoyable experience, because man, it can suck sometimes.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Remind me, I don't know if I can't remember if I ever asked you this. How long have you been a chef for?
Well, I graduated from the culinary arts program in 2007. So I've been working kind of since then in various capacities. So I guess we can say since 2007.
15 year, no, that's not good math. 16. So a veteran in the industry will say,
Well,
let's
okay,
see.
sure.
So, I mean, not to put pressure on, but what I'm trying to say is you have a wealth of experience professionally, but then also obviously personal, as you mentioned. So, let's dive in. I think you mentioned that you had a list of things you wanted to go through. I took a read through this list. I think it's awesome. So basically, challenges, shortcomings, how to overcome them, some of the common things that and then looking through the list. Also, I have noticed with the clients that we work with, heck, probably even family members and friends and stuff like that. Where do you want to start?
Well, like you said, like I guess we can start with the challenges and shortcomings that people kind of come across because
Yeah.
that's kind of what inspired this whole topic. So,
Mm.
like I would say, a recurring theme that I hear from people in my life or people that I work with or just people I talk with is this issue of the desire being there. They want to be in the kitchen. They want to cook meals for their families, usually. Um, but the main thing is time. It's always time.
Mm.
People kind of see being in the kitchen as something that's going to take a lot of their time and it's going to take a lot of mental energy, a lot of physical energy. And then it just sort of like your perspective shifts to cooking as being a chore, something to get over with as quickly as possible so I can get on to other things. Life just moves at such a relentless pace these days. Everyone is so busy. We're trying to fit it all in. That's a topic for a whole other podcast we could talk about for a long time. But the first thing is to just admit to ourselves we're never going to fit it all in. And we need to just decide what is a priority for ourselves day to day. But if the desire to be in the kitchen is there, then implementing some of these things to be a more efficient cook is going to just transform your experience of being in the kitchen in the first place. It's going to make you more confident and more in control, more relaxed in the kitchen, and that just makes your experience better. So that's kind of where this all came from.
And I can say personally that periodically there is a period of time where I'm just like, I don't want to do any of this. I would just want to have somebody cook for me. The amount of times I've told people, and it's kind of funny, sometimes admitting this, being where I am in the position that I am, and being a dietitian, it's like, oh, I should be the person that just loves spending all the time in the kitchen. It's what I look forward to at the end of the day, every day, all day. You know, there are times where I'm like, man, I would so love to have a personal chef that just cooks my meals for me.
I hear you. I know. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a common thing. And I mean, the kitchen is my happy place. I love being in there, but even I have my days where I just am like, I'm too tired. I don't have the mental energy to do this right now. So it's totally normal to feel that way for
Yeah.
everybody, including the professionals.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. So hopefully that decreases the barrier and, destigmatizes the not wanting to be in the kitchen. But hopefully some of the things we go through will help decrease the barrier a little bit and knock down the mental block that can happen. I think for me, a lot of things that I hear from people is that, and for whatever reason, the classic, like, have an accumulation of tools and gadgets and things in the kitchen. Some they might not know how to use.
Hmm.
Some they have had for a while and they forgot about. Some that require a lot of maintenance. So like you first get it and it's awesome, but then as soon as, like, you have to clean it, or you have to, you know, maintain it, buy a new part for it, replace it, maybe even.
Hmm.
That, once you get into that territory, so then you accumulate a bunch of things that, were good at one point, or maybe had novelty, and then now you have a kitchen full of stuff, and it's like every time you want to make sometimes it's like, oh, which things do I use? And then
Yeah,
decision fatigue sets in, and it's just easier to just order from Skip the Dishes or Uber Eats. So
totally.
it makes total sense in some cases. When you follow the steps there.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like even just the visual clutter of having stuff everywhere is just like, I don't want to deal with this right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that 100%.
Mm.
So yeah, there's a lot of barriers there to preventing people from having a good time in the kitchen or wanting to feel motivated in the first place. I totally get it.
Yeah. 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 Well, let's start with the first thing that we have here. So you have here something about the process of looking at recipes. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so I mean, lots of people cook without recipes. I should acknowledge that first. But if you're somebody who is looking in, doing meal planning or not, even if you just are looking through recipes, maybe find one that appeals to you and you decide, I want to try making this on the weekend, whatever. I recommend a good place to start is to just read through your recipe top to bottom. And I recommend doing this twice, actually. So the first time is when you first pick your recipe that you're interested in. So I assume you kind of glance through the ingredients first and make sure that it's stuff you have or able to acquire stuff you're interested in. But the method is very important to read through because it's sort of like when they say to athletes to kind of visualize your game before you go in, and you're going to have better success when you kind of visualize how the game's going to go. So it's the same thing here where there's no unpleasant surprises. You're seeing what is expected of you for this recipe, and then you know how much time you need to plan. The worst thing is when you pick a recipe, let's say it's like a one pot pasta recipe, and you're like, this is going to be so fast and easy. Start it at 5 o'clock. It'll be ready by 6. Then halfway through the recipe, it says, oh, now simmer the sauce for 3 hours. And you're like, oh dear, now I need to have dinner at 8 o'clock. So if that came out of nowhere and you were not prepared for that, that can completely ruin your whole day. And especially if you're doing it on a weekday, let alone a weekend. So knowing this stuff in advance just helps you to be more prepared, helps you to know what kind of tools you need, what kind of techniques are involved. You can kind of visualize how long it's going to take you and how difficult it's going to be or easy. And then I recommend reading through it again when you're ready to actually start your cooking, because that sort of leads into my next point, which is getting yourself prepped for the recipe, getting out your tools, knowing what you need to do the recipe. Yeah.
everything you just said is just like, oh man, the times where I did not do that. It's such a, you know what, a lot of validity. I think the one thing that was coming to my mind when you were just talking through that is how I feel, and maybe it's just me. There's probably a part of it that is me, is how inaccurate the duration of the cook, the how long this recipe is going to take. I can't think of the right words for that. It's always at the top of the recipe of like, this could take
Yeah.
20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever else. For me, it's never that. And part of it is because usually when I'm making recipes, and a lot of the clients that I work with, they batch cook. So they're like doubling or tripling the
Right.
recipe. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
going to take longer. So when you read through the recipe, obviously you're going to get a sense of everything that you need to do, and then you're going to be like, okay, 30 minutes, no, this ain't going to take 30 minutes. So it sounds like it's not only good to read through the recipe top to bottom a couple times, like right as you're going to make it, but then maybe also ahead of time,
Yeah.
so that you can know, oh, maybe I shouldn't start this, 30
Yeah.
minutes before I want to eat it, kind of thing, for the reasons you
Totally.
mentioned.
Yeah, well, and it can also help you decide if it's even a recipe you want to pick in the first place. Maybe you love the sound of the ingredients, but the method just sounds like way too much fiddling around for you, and that's just maybe you can find a similar recipe that has the same similar ingredients but doesn't require 3 hours of simmering, or maybe you don't need to marinate your meat for 3 hours in the fridge before starting, kind of, those kinds of things. So that's another reason to read through your recipes for sure.
Too much fiddling around. Yep.
Yes.
Totally. Totally. Yes. Why is there 20 steps to this recipe when it can easily
Yeah.
be five?
Right.
Yeah, totally. All right. Valuable. Valuable. But you mentioned that this leads into your next point. What's your next point?
Yeah. So the part that I was talking about, like reading through the recipe, knowing what's coming, knowing what equipment you need, that sort of leads me to probably the most important takeaway that I would say from this podcast today is mise en place. So that's a French term used in professional kitchens and in home kitchens. It basically just means put in place. So you're prepping your stuff in advance. Now, I want to talk about this because it sounds counterintuitive. Lots of people think that it's going to add time to your time in the kitchen to do mise en place because it sort of sounds backwards. Oh, I need to spend a bunch of time up front chopping up all my stuff, getting all my equipment out. This is just going to add more time. How is this going to save me time? Right?
Fair.
So it does sound that way, but believe it or not, it does end up saving you time in the end. Because I used to cook. I used to try cooking this way, where you start cooking. You start cooking something on the stove. Let's say you're cooking some chicken. The same time, your next step says you have to add onions to your pan. So you're chopping your onion while the chicken's cooking. I am not good at multitasking with this kind of thing. I like to pay attention to what I'm doing, especially around sharp knives and like hot things like stoves. But
Mm.
anyway, you're darting back and forth between the two things. You start to feel frantic. Your chicken might burn before you're done chopping up your onion, or maybe it'll overcook and get dry, and it just leads to like all these little mistakes being made along the way. You feel stressed, everything's turning into a mess, those kinds of things. So mise en place is just so important to like just have everything set out and ready for you as you go. So like first thing that I do when I get into the kitchen is most recipes you either need the stove top or you need the oven. So if I need to boil water for pasta or for something else, turn on the pot of water right away or start to preheat your oven. So your oven's going to come up to temperature or your water is going to boil before you're done prepping everything, but you can turn them off, and then bringing them back up to temperature will take 2 or 3 minutes versus 15 minutes when you actually need it. So that's the first thing. That's just like a really simple, easy thing. But then like the actual mise en place thing. So I like to think of it as like, okay, you think about watching Food Network or YouTube cooking thing, and you have the chefs with all these little tiny bowls with each ingredient in its own bowl. And
Mm.
so people always think mise en place isn't for me because I don't have 81 of these little bowls, and and that takes so much time. But it doesn't have to be like that, and it doesn't have to be to that extreme. What I would recommend doing is like chopping up all your stuff, all your vegetables. I always put it on like a big dinner plate, like in little piles on a dinner plate. Doesn't add any extra dishes. You can throw your plate in the dishwasher,
Mm-hmm.
or or on a tray or a baking sheet or something. If it's a huge amount of vegetables, you can put it in a big bowl or a measuring cup or something like that. And then there's certain things you can mix together, right? If you're, this is comes back to reading your recipe through, right? Because there'll be a step that says, okay, now it's time to add your chicken broth, your garlic, your rosemary, and your white wine. You can mix all of that together into a measuring cup and have that ready to go and have that lined up for whenever you're going to need it. So you don't need to have your chicken stock in one bowl, your white wine in another bowl, and your garlic in another bowl. You can mix that all up. So that's part of being prepped as well. So then once you get all that stuff ready to go, obviously you can start your cooking. Tools, as you were mentioning before too, important to have those out, at least to an extent. I wouldn't recommend getting absolutely every tool out, because then that just clutters up your countertop and makes you feel disorganized. So I always have my stuff, like my drawers with all my tools are pretty organized, and they're right by my cooking area. So like they're within arm's reach anyway. But I always get out like key things like a colander for draining pasta or for draining a can of beans or something like that. I like to have those kinds of things kind of ready. Have like a baking sheet out lined with parchment paper because you need that later. Or do you need to grease a baking dish with some nonstick cooking spray, that kind of stuff. Like get that kind of stuff out so you're not fiddling with that. You have all your stuff prepped, then you start your cooking. So this is where people think, okay, but I could have been spending all that time like multitasking, and I would have been so much faster. But the part that people don't consider is the cleanup. So you want to stay clean as you go. And this is something I used to be terrible at. Like it looked like a hurricane came through my kitchen before. But I
Just stuff
decided,
everywhere,
oh, it's
stuff all in the
brutal.
sink, on the floor.
Oh
Yep.
yeah. Oh, it looked horrible. And then you look at it after you're eating dinner and you're thinking, oh, now I still have like an hour more of prep to do or like just
Mm.
clean up to do now, which is part of the discouragement that people feel around cooking too. So if you clean as you go, it's much easier to do that if you've done your prep and your mise en place. Because let's say you're making something on the stove and it says, okay, like just cook this and stir it occasionally for 8 to 10 minutes. So during that time where you would normally be chopping your next vegetable and feeling stressed and frantic, now you can go to the sink and wash a few dishes, get those in the dish drainer, and you can clean these as you go too. So like, let's say I peeled a carrot and I'm done peeling stuff now. I don't need it anymore. I can go wash that right away and get that done. Maybe I juiced a lemon and I measured out the lemon juice. I can go wash my juicer and get that out of the way. So you don't have that cluttering up your space. You don't have a big pile of dishes waiting for you. Again, this sounds like it adds time, but you need to wash those dishes anyways. So you want to have a pile of 2 hours worth of dishes, or just do it as you go. And you're going to
Yep.
find these little pockets of time when you're cooking, right? When you're
Yep.
something's simmering for 8 to 10 minutes, you can go and wash a few dishes, get things out of the way. And then ideally, if you've done it right at the end of your cooking, the only thing you have left to cook is whatever pot or pan has your food in it, your serving utensils, and maybe your like whatever your plates and your cups and stuff that you're eating off
Mm.
of. So like that is so much better
Yeah.
if you can manage that.
And it also a point about like if you're washing dishes in those little spare pockets of time, like there's no rush to get the dishes done for your next step where you would like if you had to chop something in that little pocket of time, it's like, oh, I need to get this done right away because I need this for my next step. But if it's just
Right.
dishes, you can just leave it whenever you need to,
Yeah.
unless you're me and you get so into the zone in dishes you forget there's stuff on the stove. That happens sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I that makes a lot of sense, and I can definitely see when you put all the pieces, kind of lay them out and what's going on. It's like, oh, this is going to take a lot longer. Ultimately, I think if it takes the same amount of time, even heck, if it takes 5 more minutes, it sounds a lot less stressful. So that extra time probably won't, like, you probably won't even seem like it's a bunch of extra time because hopefully you won't be like all, scattered all over the place, very stressed
Right.
out by the end of it. And it'll be a
Right.
lot more of an enjoyable experience overall.
Yeah, and
Hopefully.
that's the whole thing, right? It's like I would argue that doing these things saves time, but even like you said, even if you end up coming out the exact same, or maybe even adding a few minutes, like what's 5 minutes, right?
Hmm.
Which I don't think that usually is the case. I have found that it has sped up my cooking a lot, just from experience. But like you said, the whole thing comes down to when you sit down at the end of all this, your recipe is more likely to turn out because you're organized, you have things lined up where you need them, you don't have to scramble to grab things, to chop things, and worry about what's happening on the stove at the same time. You feel in control, you feel confident. Then you sit down, your recipe turned out, you feel proud of yourself because it turned out great. You look back behind you, my kitchen's pretty clean, and you think back to the whole experience of cooking and you think that was actually like not that bad compared to what I thought it was going to be. If it can be like this every time, I would do this more. So it sort of becomes this like feedback loop of like, well, now I'm encouraged to do this more. And then you have these systems in place that help you out that just continue to feed into your confidence levels because you're just proud of yourself and you're having success from your recipes because you've set yourself up that way.
I think there's something to be said too about if you're doing all of these things, there may be a step or two ahead of time that you need to make sure is in place such that you can have all of the, if there's a few extra bowls that you need or the counter space. So like you may need to clear the counter space. You may need to do a little bit of dishes ahead of time such that you have the counter space and flexibility. Heck, maybe you just want to stack them all in the corner so that at least you have more counter space. You don't need to wash them all.
Right.
But then making sure you have like at least one of those plates, maybe a few bowls that you can use, ideally dishwasher safe, so you can just yuck them in the dishwasher after, so that the steps you just laid out there, like you can go through it and then not get halfway down and be like, oh dang, I'm out of bowls. I was going to put this thing in its bowl. So consider that too when you're reading things beforehand of like, okay, do I have this to have that? Oh, it's in the dishwasher. It's not clean yet. Maybe I'll wash that quick or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. It's the worst feeling when you're halfway through a recipe and you think, oh no, I need to wash this dish out of the dishwasher so that I can measure this thing. And meanwhile, everything's simmering over here. And I was
Yeah.
trying to chop my onion over there. Like it's just a frantic, just even talking this through is like making me feel stressed out,
Yeah.
just that whole process. So if you can avoid that, it just, oh
Hmm.
my gosh, it can transform your cooking from being like a thing I have to do and get over with to like, hey, I feel like calm. I feel relaxed. I
Hmm.
feel, dare I say, like I'm enjoying this maybe. I don't want to go quite that far. I know some people don't love being in the kitchen as much as I do and I understand that, but yeah, like it can completely change your whole experience to one of like, hey, that wasn't that bad. I always thought that being in the kitchen just meant stress and being frantic, but it doesn't have to be that way.
It wasn't a complete dumpster fire.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if it's not, it maybe if it's not the most enjoyable thing, it wasn't absolutely brutal to the point where now my evening is ruined. I can
Right.
still move on and it might take a bit of time to progress, obviously, but
For sure.
it definitely sounds less stressful than the alternative of what we just described of how it could be where stuff's everywhere. It's which
Yeah, and I
one?
mean, you have to like hone your own process. Like not all of these things might apply to everybody. Everyone has a different way of doing things, so I encourage you to, play around and experiment and find a system that works the best for you. And maybe try implementing one or two of these things and at a time. Like you don't need to memorize, like this isn't a manual that you have to follow and everything's going to be a failure if you don't do all of these things starting today. But they're just things that as you progress through your journey of learning to cook better, you can start implementing these things and you'll start to notice a difference. I think because I did in my cooking, I noticed a huge difference, and even like I've always loved being in the kitchen, but I really enjoy being in the kitchen so much more now that I'm more organized. There's just like a ton of little things that you can bring into your toolbox um, to keep yourself organized.
Totally. The next point you have up here is one that I really enjoy about tools in the kitchen. Speaking of tools in the kitchen, is taking care of your knives.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, that'll make things faster right on its own. So you want to keep your knives sharp. It sounds so obvious, but I think a lot of us neglect our knives. I know a ton of people, and I've been there too, where your knives just get dull and it feels like a lot to keep them sharp sometimes, but it's so worth it just for safety too. You don't want to, you're much less likely to cut yourself, believe it or not, with a sharp knife than a dull knife. So just for safety purposes on its own, but also if it's sharp, it's doing the work for you. You're not putting all of your muscle into chopping through stuff. So your prep will go a lot faster if you take care of your knives and keep them sharp. So really recommend taking the time to do that.
Or if you don't know how, I mean, you can always, there's places around that sharpen knives, either a knife shop, something
Totally.
like that. I find that one of the things related to why the sharp knives are safer is that they're more predictable. Like
Yeah.
if you go to cut something, it will cut it, as opposed to like, oh, at what point when I'm chopping or slicing this thing is the knife going to start to go through it?
Right.
And
Yeah,
then it just
you're
like
guessing.
you're slicing it and then thunk on the chopping board,
Yeah.
and whereas sharp knives very much less likely to do that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And like there's foods that are slippery, like onions are so tricky because they have all the layers and they're kind of slippery, or like carrots, because they're round. So they roll around on you and they take a bit more force to cut through. So then if your knives aren't sharp, you're pushing down so much harder. And then you lose that predictability of knowing when it's going to actually cut through. So those two things combined create a disaster where you're just pushing down hard and then maybe it lands on your hand and then you cut yourself, right? So and that's just not a good time.
I cut the wrong meat.
Yeah, exactly. Eh?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Man, wicked. Any other things that come to mind? This was really cool having this conversation. And I know we're having more episodes going deeper into other areas. But before we leave for today, any other points to polish this conversation off?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you can always find more little tips and tricks out there from different people you talk to. Everyone has their own little systems that work, and a whole bunch that I didn't get it around to talking about today, like just little things that you can try. So, experiment with trying new things, talk to people in your life that maybe cook a bit, and you can get some tips from them on what they do. And everybody has a different story. So it's always interesting to hear what works for some people and what doesn't for other people. And, but the main thing is just to try to hone your process a little bit and to be intentional about what you're doing and to just take a little bit of time to be organized up front, and then it'll pay off when it actually comes time to be in the kitchen.
Or do a cooking session with Chef Lisa?
Yeah.
Uh-huh,
Yeah,
uh-huh.
I can work with you on this stuff and show you these
Yeah,
things in
there you
person.
go.
Totally.
Love it. Well, I had a blast. I hope you had a blast.
I did.
I hope everybody listening got something out of this. I know even when I do these episodes and talking about these different things, stuff comes to my mind about heck how I can do things better, things that I can talk to my clients about. So I know it does a lot of good stuff for me. But we have more episodes with you coming up, so I'm looking forward to them.
Yes, me too. They'll be great.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks for joining, Lisa, and we'll talk next time.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on.